In November of 1951, a man in Connecticut gave an order that had nothing to do with engineering. Change the eagle from red to black. He never explained it in a catalog, and he never changed it back. 4 years later, a friend walked into his office carrying 5 empty cartridge cases somebody had thrown in the garbage, stamped for a round that did not officially exist yet. And somewhere in this country tonight, there is an old revolver sitting in a safe, with a single letter hidden underneath its grip frame. The man who owns it is certain his gun has never been touched. That letter says otherwise. A black eagle. 5 pieces of brass. 1 hidden letter. Not one of them is an accident. And the story only gets stranger from here. Number 1. Start with 2 men, because the company that built this revolver began as a friendship. One of them was William Batterman Ruger. He had the engineering. What he did not have was money. The other was Alexander Sturm. He was an artist and a writer, a Yale graduate who had published illustrated children's books before he finished school, and he was 25 years old when he put $50,000 behind a gunmaker who had never sold a gun. Sturm did not sit in the background. He answered the letters and kept the records. And because he had spent his life studying heraldry, he drew the company a trademark, a red eagle. 2 years in, he fell ill with viral hepatitis. After about 10 days in the hospital, he died. He was 28. And Bill Ruger changed the eagle from red to black. No press release, no explanation printed on a box, just a color change on every gun the company made from that year forward. Sturm never saw the Blackhawk. He never saw the 10-22 or the Mini 14 or any of the guns that made his name the first word in an American institution. Every Blackhawk ever built carries that mark on the side of the frame. Most of the men who own one have no idea what they are looking at. 2 small corrections, because both of these circulate constantly. It is not a phoenix. It is a heraldic eagle, drawn by a man who cared about that distinction. And the red eagle did come back, on commemorative guns, after Bill Ruger himself died in 2002. He kept it black for as long as he was alive to decide. Number 2. It is worth pausing on how small this operation was. While Sturm answered the mail, his wife, a granddaughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, helped stuff envelopes on Sunday afternoons. That is the scale of the company about to walk into a market Colt had abandoned. Number 3. And Colt had abandoned it completely. Production of the single-action army stopped in 1941, when the steel was needed elsewhere. After the war, Colt looked at the old cowboy gun and saw no reason to bring it back. Then television happened. Through the 1950s, the country went mad for westerns, and every man and boy in America wanted a single-action revolver. The most famous name in American handguns was not making one. Ruger moved into that empty room, a .22 single-six in 1953. Then, in a full-page advertisement in August of 1955, a centerfire revolver in .357 Magnum, catalog number BKH3, the Blackhawk. Colt returned to the single-action army the following year. Nobody has produced a memo proving Ruger forced that decision. But by the time Colt came back, a company that made .22 pistols had already proven the market was still there. Number 4. It looked like it rode out of 1873. Underneath, almost nothing about it was old. Colt's single-action ran on flat-leaf springs, thin strips of steel that snapped, which turned a revolver in the middle of nowhere into a paperweight. Ruger built his gun on coil springs and said plainly that this solved one of the primary weaknesses of the Colt design. He gave it a rear sight you could actually adjust, where the Colt gave you a fixed groove. And he poured the frame instead of machining it, using investment casting at a time when half the industry sneered at cast steel. That is usually told as a metallurgy lesson. It was really a business answer to a hard question. How do you build a revolver a working man can afford without making it weaker than the one it replaces? Here is the part that surprises people who have owned one for 30 years. It was never a solid block of steel. The frame was cast chrome molybdenum. But the grip frame, the part your hand actually holds, was cast aluminum alloy. The toughest cowboy gun in America came out of the gate with a piece of aluminum in it, because Ruger put weight only where the pressure was. Number 5. It sold for $87.50. For that money, you got better sights, better springs, and a frame that would outlast the Colt it was imitating, and you got it for less than the Colt cost, which is why the next number matters. In that entire first year of production, only about 1,750 Blackhawks left the factory. Those earliest guns have a look collectors can spot across a room. A clean, flat top strap over the cylinder, with the adjustable sight sitting low and nothing built up around it. Flat tops. And the thing that ended them was not failure. It was an improvement. In 1962, Ruger protected the rear sight with raised ears on either side and reshaped the grip frame to give a fuller hold. Sensible engineering. Better for most shooters. It also closed the flat-top profile forever, at somewhere under 40,000 guns. That is the whole mechanism behind the prices you see today, not age. A configuration that was shut off, permanently, at a small number, by a company trying to make the gun nicer. One honest warning, because this is where people lose money. Condition and originality decide the price, not the model name. And a gun buffed to look new has usually been buffed out of most of its value. Somewhere in that first run were serial numbers 9 and 10, engraved, and given as a matched pair to the editor of Gun Digest. Number 6. Now the story everyone tells about this revolver, and the part they leave out. In 1955, someone walked into Bill Ruger's office carrying 5 fired cartridge cases pulled out of a scrap heap in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The head stamp read .44 Magnum. Remington was still keeping the cartridge secret. It is a perfect scene. A gunmaker reverse engineering a ghost out of somebody's garbage. It is also cleaner than the surviving record. American Rifleman says a friend stopped by, in '55. American Handgunner says a Ruger employee found them, in a dumpster or a scrap yard, in late '55 or early '56. Another account has a Remington man simply handing Ruger the details. And at least one writer has raised the deflating possibility that nobody needed a scrap heap at all. Anyone watching the industry closely could have worked out what Remington was building. So what actually survives is this. 5 cases existed. The scrap heap is in the record. The name of the man who carried them is not settled, and there is no living witness to any version of it, which is how most gun history works. Every retelling sands off one more edge, and the smoothest version is the one that gets remembered. Number 7. What Ruger did next is not in dispute, because the objects exist. He did not design a new revolver. He took Blackhawks he already had, 3 .57 Magnums, in 3 different barrel lengths, and had them rechambered for the .44 Magnum. Then he took them to the NRA convention and put them on a table. The first .44 Magnum Blackhawks in the world were not new guns. They were 3 .57s that had been opened up. That is how a small company moved fast enough to stand beside Smith & Wesson on the biggest cartridge launch of the decade. Number 8. Which brings us to an argument that has been running for 70 years, and to a question nobody has actually answered. Who got there first? Smith & Wesson's first .44 Magnum revolver was finished in December of 1955, or the 15th, if you follow the company's own date, or the 29th, if you follow the writers who documented it in the gun press. 2 reliable sources, 2 weeks apart, on the same gun. That first revolver went to Remington. The next 2 went to Major Julian Hatcher at the NRA and to Elmer Keith in Salmon, Idaho. It was announced to the public in January of 1956, at $140. Now Ruger. One account puts the .44 Magnum Blackhawk on the market in November of '56 at $96. Another says the first guns shipped in early '57, and a writer who was there remembers them reaching dealer shelves that year. And one widely read reference states flatly that Ruger beat Smith & Wesson to market by several months in 1956. This is where the surviving records stop agreeing with each other. And the reason is simpler than it looks. There are at least 5 different finish lines in this race. A prototype, the first gun completed, the public announcement, the first shipment. The first time an ordinary man walked out of a store holding one. For 70 years, people have argued about who was first while quietly using different definitions of the word. Both companies were in the .44 Magnum business by the end of 1956. Everything past that depends on which finish line you accept, and that is a decision, not a fact. Number 9. There is a detail about Elmer Keith and Bill Ruger that changes how you read all of this. They were not 2 names in the same industry. They were friends. In the early 1950s, before any of it existed, Ruger drove from New England out to Salmon, Idaho. And that is a long way in a 1950s automobile. To put a prototype single-six in Keith's hands and ask what he thought about the centerfire gun he was planning. Keith was a rancher and a working handgun hunter who had spent decades pushing revolver cartridges past what the factories thought reasonable, and by then he was the most listened-to voice in American handgunning. So the Blackhawk did not simply arrive out of an engineering department. It passed through the hands of a man who shot 6 guns for a living, before it was a gun at all. Number 10. Though right in the hand needs an asterisk. The .44 Magnum recoil complaints came fast, and in 1959 Ruger answered with the Super Blackhawk. Heavier frame, unfluted cylinder, longer grip, and a squared trigger guard borrowed from the dragoon pistols of the 1800s. Early ones shipped in a mahogany case. And that square trigger guard produced the single most common complaint you will ever hear about these revolvers. Under full .44 Magnum recoil, the back edge of it slams into the knuckle of your middle finger, shot after shot, until it opens the skin. Grown men buy rubber grips to pad one edge. The gun built to tame recoil is the one that bites the hand firing it. If this is the version of firearms history you came for, the part sitting underneath the catalog story, then you are in the right place. Number 11. Back to Elmer Keith, because his fingerprints are on another Blackhawk. In the mid-1960s, Keith, the Border Patrol legend Bill Jordan, and the writer Skeeter Skelton talked the industry into a cartridge that split the difference between the mild .357 and the punishing .44, the .41 Magnum. Ruger chambered the Blackhawk for it, and the first one out of the factory went to Keith. He had it built the way he wanted it. Short barrel, brass grip frame, wide trigger, fancy walnut. And he carried it in Idaho's Passamaquoddy Valley, taking mule deer and jackrabbits with it while testing his own bullet designs. That revolver still exists, in a private collection, timing perfect and groups tight. The .41 Magnum itself never caught on. Police departments passed on it, ammunition stayed scarce, and the semi-automatic pistol ended the conversation, which makes it the great orphan of American handgunning. Not an engineering failure, a timing failure. And the men who love it like a religion, partly because the man who fathered the Magnum era chose one for himself. Number 12. And while all of this was happening, Bill Ruger was thinking about cars. The Blackhawk is named after one. The Stutz Blackhawk, a speedster from the 1920s. So is the Bearcat. But naming was not enough. At the end of the 1960s, Ruger and his son spent something in the neighborhood of $800,000 building their own automobile from scratch, in a shop set up inside the gun factory. A 427 cubic inch Ford V8, Italian wire wheels, a body shaped like a 1920s Bentley. A British magazine tested one and recorded 0 to 60 in 7.7 seconds, with the clutch slipping. 2 were built. That was the end of it. Number 13. He also built a revolver that no rational market analysis would have asked for. In 1968, Ruger chambered the Blackhawk for the .30 Carbine, the rifle cartridge from the little M1 carbine of the Second World War. The reason was pure opportunity. The military had moved on, and surplus military ammunition was flooding the country by the ton. Fire one and you will never forget it. The muzzle blast is enormous. The flash is a camera flash from arm's length. People will tell you, only half joking, that hearing protection is not optional. And here is where the legend gets ahead of the physics. That fireball is not a sign of power. It is a sign of power leaving. Chronographed out of the 7.5-inch Blackhawk, standard ball ammunition runs around 1,528 feet per second. The same cartridge out of the 18-inch carbine it was designed for runs close to 1,990. Nearly a quarter of the velocity never becomes work. It becomes light and noise out in front of the muzzle, where it cannot help you. Which is worth remembering every time a short barrel puts on a show. Spectacle is not performance. Number 14. Then there are the Blackhawks that exist because, one distributor asked. At the end of the 1980s, a shop in Ohio had Ruger build convertibles nobody else could get. First a 3220 with a second cylinder in 32 H&R Magnum, then a 3840. A black powder-era cowboy cartridge, shipped with a cylinder chambered in 10mm auto, an 1890s round and a 1980s round, in the same revolver, and buyers of the first run were offered matching serial numbers on the second. There is a 10mm Blackhawk out there. Most Ruger owners have never heard of it. Number 15. And then there is the one that got away from them. In 1983, Ruger and Remington stretched the .357 case and built the .357 Maximum on a longer Blackhawk frame. On paper, the most powerful production revolver cartridge of its kind. Within roughly 18 months, gone. What went wrong is still argued, and both halves are worth hearing. American Rifleman describes it as close to inherent. In those long chambers, the powder burned so hot that the ring of fire at the cylinder gap began cutting the top strap within a handful of rounds and eroding the forcing cone at the back of the barrel. The other side, the silhouette shooters, and the writers who actually competed with it, argue the cartridge was built around heavy bullets and slow powder, and that the light, fast loads it got instead did the real damage. They also note the cutting tended to stop after the first 1,000 rounds, and that Dan Wesson kept chambering the round for years and kept winning with it. Even the production count refuses to settle, running from about 7,500 guns in one source to well over 16,000 frames and finished revolvers in another, thousands of them scrapped. What is not disputed is what Ruger did. The company stopped production and refunded owners who wanted out. Companies discontinue cartridges all the time. They almost never buy the guns back. So by the middle 1980s, Ruger had already learned what it costs to pay for a product problem in public. But the problem that shadowed the Blackhawk family was much older than that, and far more personal. Number 16. Every Blackhawk built from 1955 through 1972 shares one piece of architecture with the Colt it was imitating. The firing pin is fixed to the hammer. There is a notch that holds the hammer back a hair, and skilled men carried these guns their whole lives without incident by understanding exactly what that notch was, and what it was not. It was a position for loading and unloading. It was not a drop safety, which is why the practice, for generations, was 5 rounds with the hammer resting on an empty chamber. Not a preference. The way the gun was meant to be carried. Now consider what that means about the sound everybody loves. Those 4 distinct clicks coming back on the hammer, the sound people call the soul of a single action. That is a mechanism with no safety device in it. Number 17. In 1973, after lawsuits, that changed. The new model arrived with a transfer bar, a small piece of steel that only rises between hammer and firing pin when the trigger is held. Hammer down, finger off, the hammer physically cannot reach the pin. For the first time, you could load 6 and carry it. One little bar of steel, and it divides everything about the Blackhawk into before and after. It also cost something that was on no spec sheet. The loading gate now controlled the cylinder, and the 4 clicks were gone. A generation of owners described that the way you would describe losing a voice. Number 18. Then Ruger did something that has almost no parallel in this industry. In 1975, the company offered to install the new safety system in any old 3-screw single action. Free. No receipt, no time limit, no questions. And to encourage people to actually send them in, Ruger mailed the original factory parts back with the gun, and told owners in its own literature that the value of the revolver would not be impaired. 50 years later, that program is still running. Buy a new Ruger today and there is still paperwork about it in the box. 2 honest notes. Some accounts date the workable retrofit kit closer to 1980, so the machinery of it took time, and the parts came back only when they came back serviceable, which is quieter than it sounds, and we will come back to it. Number 19. Because there is one more thing Ruger did during that conversion, and it is the reason your grandfather's revolver may not be what the seller told you. When the factory installs the conversion, it stamps a letter into the frame, an R. Not on the outside, not under the grip panels, on the frame itself, the serialized part, hidden completely by the grip frame, which has to come off to see it. Here is where the internet gets this wrong, and it matters, because people pay for the mistake. The common test you will hear is that 3 screws means old and 2 pins means new. But a converted gun is not turned into a new model. It keeps its 3 screws. The retrofit parts are not even the same parts a new model uses. And what that letter actually tells you is narrower than people claim. It indicates the factory converted the gun at some point. It does not tell you what is inside it right now, because the conversion is reversible and owners have reversed it. The absence of the letter proves less still. Collectors have reported converted guns where no stamp could be found, and the earliest conversions are described as unmarked. A factory letter will not settle it either. Only the gun will. What is consistent across decades of published collector reporting is the mark, where it sits, and why it is there. A company recording its own correction on the one part that carries the serial number. And then there is the detail that stops people cold. When owners say Ruger never returned their parts, the likeliest explanation is that the parts came back broken. A cracked safety notch, a failed sear. Which means some of those men had been carrying a revolver that was already damaged for years without knowing. Number 20. So the question was never really old model or new model. Imagine the 3-screw in your safe is not something you bought. Your father carried it for 40 years. The finish is worn where his hand went. The action feels the way it feels because of how many thousands of times he cocked it. The parts inside are the parts that were inside when he was alive. Ruger will make that gun safer, for free, forever. The program works. The danger it addresses is real. It hurt people, and that is why the lawsuits existed. But the repair changes the trigger. It puts a letter in the steel. And to a part of the market, it takes the gun out of the category of untouched. So a man ends up standing between two things. On one side, preserving exactly what his father left him, and carrying 5 rounds the way his father did, which is not recklessness. It is a practice older than the transfer bar, kept by people who knew precisely what they were holding. On the other, the grandchild who opens that safe someday, who was never taught any of it. Both of those are acts of respect. They just respect different things. I won't tell you which one is right. Number 21. Something else was happening to that frame while its owners argued about the ones already built. 45 Colt did not reach the Blackhawk until 1971, and only on the big frame. Because that frame is stronger than a century of weaker 45 Colt revolvers, reloading manuals to this day carry a separate section for Ruger guns, while factory ammunition stays deliberately held back, because a factory has to assume its cartridge might end up in the weakest gun still out there. Those numbers are published. What matters here is why they exist, and that none of it transfers to smaller frames. Number 22. In 1986, Ruger added a grip frame shaped after the old Colt Bisley target guns. On paper, it is a shape change. It was the piece that opened a door. Starting in 1988, a gunsmith named John Linebaugh began building custom 5-shot revolvers on new model Blackhawk and Bisley frames. Fewer chambers, far bigger holes, in cartridges of his own design. The .475 Linebaugh, then the .500. Hamilton Bowen of Bowen Classic Arms and a handful of others followed. Be clear about what these are. Custom revolvers, built on Blackhawk frames, not factory chamberings. SAAM, I never standardized them, and you cannot walk into a store and buy one, because what those men proved is that the frame Ruger poured for a cowboy gun in 1955 could be taken somewhere nobody at the company had planned for. Guns built on it have been carried after Cape Buffalo. So the plainest revolver in the case, the one everybody walks past to reach something plastic, is the skeleton underneath some of the most powerful packable handguns human beings have ever made. The Blackhawk's real gift was never what it fires, it is what it will tolerate. Number 23. It also went backwards, which almost nobody expects. In 1972, Ruger took the old 3-screw action and built a cap-and-ball percussion revolver around it. Loose powder, a lead ball, a percussion cap. 19th century operation, 20th century steel. They called it the Old Army, and it is widely regarded as the finest production percussion revolver ever made. It stayed in the catalog until 2008. 36 years. A longer run than any actual Civil War-era percussion revolver ever had. And it never got a transfer bar. It used safety notches between the chambers, the way percussion revolvers had since the 1850s, and Ruger sold it new that way until the end. That is not hypocrisy, and it is worth being careful here. A muzzle loader is loaded, carried, and fired differently from a cartridge gun, and the engineering problem is not the same one. But it does tell you something about the man. The company that spent 50 years converting cartridge single actions at its own expense was, at the same time, quite happily selling a 19th century one. Number 24. In the late 1970s, another kind of mark started appearing. Ruger began rolling a warning onto the barrels of its guns. Read the instruction manual. Collectors call it the Billboard, and eventually it moved underneath the barrel where it shows less. A clean gun made before that lettering arrived still brings a premium. The engineers wrote the first marks on this revolver. That one was written by lawyers. Number 25. And then, in 1989, Bill Ruger wrote a letter. He sent it to every member of the United States Congress. His argument was that trying to outlaw or license millions of existing firearms was unworkable, and that the practical answer was to prohibit large-capacity magazines instead. Remove the magazine from the equation, and all the difficulty of defining what counts as an assault rifle disappears. This is not rumor. The text was published in a gun magazine 3 years later under his own name. In 1994, federal law arrived with a 10-round limit in it. There is also a line that has followed him ever since, that no honest man needs more than 10 rounds in any gun. Be precise about that one, because it gets handled badly in both directions. It is attributed to an interview he gave Tom Brokaw of NBC News in 1992, and serious outlets have reported it that way. The original broadcast is not sitting in a public archive. So, a documented attribution, not a transcript. Not a myth. Not a certainty either. What is beyond argument is the reaction. Many owners saw it as a betrayal, and said so for years. Others argued he was trying to save the guns by giving up the magazines, and that he badly misjudged what the concession would buy. Both readings still live in the same gun shops. And the same man did all of it. He blackened a logo for a friend who died at 28 and never changed it back. He spent decades chasing engineering problems nobody had asked him to solve, and built 2 automobiles for no commercial reason at all. He paid, out of his own pocket, for half a century, to fix a gun he had already sold. And he wrote the letter. He died in 2002. He does not fit in one sentence, and it is probably a mistake to try. So go back to the revolver. It is sitting in a case somewhere, with a price tag hanging off the trigger guard, between something plastic and something new. A grip frame most people assume is solid steel. 3 screws that may or may not still mean what everyone thinks, and a black eagle that has been in mourning since 1951 for a man who never lived to see what his $50,000 built. Part of this story came out of a scrap heap in Bridgeport, carried by somebody whose name we are no longer sure of. Part of it is 1 letter deep, hidden under a grip frame, where a company recorded its own correction on the only part that carries the serial number. And part of it is sitting in a letter from 1989 that men still argue about in parking lots almost 40 years later. A Blackhawk is an easy gun to mistake for a simple one, until you know where to look. So here is the only question worth leaving you with. If your father's untouched 3-screw Blackhawk came to you tomorrow, would you send it back to Ruger, or preserve it exactly the way he set it down? If stories like this are why you love old American firearms, subscribe. There are more of them hiding in plain sight.